June 3rd, 1944, 2100 hours, Southwick House, Portsmouth, England. In a wood-panelled library converted to a makeshift war room, the most powerful military commanders in the Western world sat in silence, watching a 41-year-old Scottish meteorologist named James Martin Stagg stand before a wall-sized weather map covered in swirling geobars and frontal systems. The fate of the largest amphibious invasion in human history rested on what this man would say next. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, sat forward in his chair, his face drawn with exhaustion. Behind him stood generals whose names would echo through history: Montgomery, Bradley, Ramsey, Lee Mallory, Tedder. Between them they commanded 156,000 men, already loaded onto ships, 11,000 aircraft fueled and armed, 5,000 vessels stretching across every port in southern England. The invasion, codenamed Operation Overlord, was scheduled to begin in less than 48 hours on June 5th. Everything was ready, everything except the weather. Stagg cleared his throat and delivered news that made every man in the room go rigid. The weather forecast for June 5th and 6th indicates conditions completely unsuitable for the invasion. A major storm system is approaching from the Atlantic. We expect winds of force 5 to 6, wave heights of 4 to 6 feet, low cloud ceiling under 500 feet, and poor visibility. These conditions will persist for at least 48 hours beginning June 4th. Eisenhower's jaw tightened. The room erupted in controlled chaos as admirals and generals demanded clarification, asked for alternatives, questioned the certainty of the forecast. But Stagg, a man who had spent the previous 3 years perfecting his craft under impossible pressure, stood firm. "The storm is coming, gentlemen. Of that I am absolutely certain." What no one in that room fully understood was that Stagg's forecast represented one of the most remarkable achievements in meteorological history. In an era before weather satellites, before computer modelling, before radar networks, Stagg and his team had detected a storm system forming 1,000 miles out in the Atlantic Ocean, using nothing but surface observations, upper air data from weather balloons, and mathematical equations scribbled on paper. They had predicted its track, its intensity, its timing, and its duration with accuracy that would have been impossible just 5 years earlier. This is the story of how weather forecasting, a science barely 50 years old in 1944, became the deciding factor in the most important military operation of World War II. It's the story of how one man's forecast delayed D-Day, how that delay created a narrow window of opportunity, and how the decision to trust that forecast changed the course of human history. Understanding the magnitude of Stagg's challenge requires understanding how primitive weather forecasting was in 1944. The science of meteorology as we know it today barely existed. The first weather map showing frontal systems had been drawn only in 1919 by Norwegian meteorologist Wilhelm Bjerknes. The concept of air masses and fronts, the foundation of modern forecasting, was less than 25 years old. There were no weather satellites, no radar weather networks, no computer models, no numerical weather prediction. Forecasting relied entirely on human analysis of surface observations, upper air data from weather balloons, and experience-based pattern recognition. Meteorologists received data from weather stations via telegraph and radio, plotted it by hand on maps, drew isobars connecting points of equal pressure, identified fronts based on wind shifts and temperature changes, and made educated guesses about where those systems would move. The Atlantic Ocean, where the storms that affected Western Europe originated, was a virtual black hole of weather data. Commercial shipping had been decimated by U-boat warfare. Weather stations in Iceland and Greenland provided some data, but between them and Europe lay 1,000 miles of ocean with virtually no observations. Forecasting for the English Channel meant predicting what Atlantic weather systems would do 24 to 48 hours in advance, with incomplete information and no way to verify until the storm arrived. James Martin Stagg was uniquely qualified for this impossible task. Born in 1900 in Dalkeith, Scotland, Stagg had studied mathematics and physics at Edinburgh University before joining the British Meteorological Office in 1924. By 1943, he was one of Britain's most experienced forecasters, having spent years analysing North Atlantic weather patterns. In January 1944, Stagg received orders that would define his career and possibly his life. He was to serve as Chief Meteorological Officer to General Eisenhower for Operation Overlord, responsible for providing weather forecasts that would determine the timing of the invasion. The appointment was political as much as scientific. The Americans had their own meteorologists, led by Colonel Irving Crick of the United States Army Air Forces and Captain Harry Wexler of the United States Navy. The British had their own teams, including the Admiralty Forecasting Service and the Royal Air Force Meteorological Section. These groups disagreed constantly, sometimes violently, about forecasting methods and interpretations. Stagg's job was to synthesize their competing forecasts into a single recommendation for Eisenhower. He had no authority to order the other meteorologists to agree with him. He could only analyze their predictions, weigh their arguments, and present conclusions based on his own judgment. It was a job that required scientific expertise, diplomatic skill, and nerves of steel. The Americans, particularly Colonel Crick, favoured an approach called analog forecasting. This method involved finding historical weather patterns similar to current conditions and assuming the weather would evolve similarly. Crick had access to decades of weather records and was supremely confident in his ability to find analogues that would predict future conditions. The British, trained in the Norwegian School of Frontal Analysis, relied more heavily on tracking air masses and fronts, using physical understanding of atmospheric dynamics to predict storm movement and development. They distrusted analogue methods, arguing that no two weather situations were ever truly identical. These philosophical differences led to bitter arguments throughout the spring of 1944. In one memorable meeting in April, Crick and British meteorologist Charles Douglas got into such a heated debate about forecasting methods that Stagg had to physically step between them. The pressure on everyone was immense, but Stagg bore the ultimate responsibility. By May 1944, the meteorological team had established a routine. 3 times daily at 0400, 1000 and 2100 hours, they would gather to analyse the latest weather data and prepare forecasts. Data arrived from hundreds of stations across Britain, Iceland and Greenland. Weather reconnaissance aircraft flew missions over the Atlantic, radioing back observations of wind, pressure, temperature and cloud conditions. Upper air data from weather balloons showed wind speeds and temperatures at various altitudes, crucial for forecasting storm movement. From this mountain of data, the meteorologists had to divine the future. The requirements for D-Day were extraordinarily specific and demanding. The planners had determined that the invasion required a very precise set of conditions. Tides had to be right. The assault required landing shortly after low tide so that beach obstacles would be visible to demolition teams, but with a rising tide to assist follow-on waves. This limited possible dates to just a few days each month when tidal conditions were suitable. Moon conditions had to be right. Airborne troops dropping behind enemy lines needed moonlight for navigation and landing. This required a night with at least a half moon rising before midnight. Wind conditions had to be acceptable. Winds above force 3, about 12 knots, would make landing craft difficult to handle and create seasickness among troops. Winds above force 5 would make landing impossible. Wave conditions had to be acceptable. Waves higher than 3 to 4 feet would swamp landing craft and make naval gunfire support impossible from smaller vessels. Cloud sealing had to be adequate. The air campaign required a cloud ceiling of at least 3,000 feet for bombers and 11,000 feet for heavy bombers. Lower clouds would make accurate bombing impossible. Visibility had to be adequate. Naval vessels needed visibility of at least 3 miles for navigation and gunfire support. Aircraft needed 5 miles visibility for effective operations. These requirements combined to create just 3 possible dates in early June, when tidal and moon conditions would be right: June 5th, 6th and 7th. If none of these dates worked, the invasion would have to be postponed until July when tides and moon would again align, assuming the secret hadn't been compromised by then. The weather window required for all conditions to be met simultaneously was vanishingly small. In the North Atlantic in June, getting even 3 of these conditions simultaneously was unusual. Getting all of them bordered on miraculous. As May turned to June, the weather remained frustratingly unstable. Storm after storm rolled in from the Atlantic, typical for the season but nerve-wracking for the planners. Stagg and his team tracked each system, noting patterns, building understanding, waiting for the critical moment. On May 29th, exactly 1 week before the scheduled invasion date, the meteorological team began detecting signs of something unusual developing far out in the Atlantic. Surface pressure readings from ships and the handful of ocean weather stations showed a deepening low-pressure system west of Ireland. Upper air data indicated strong winds at altitude, suggesting the system was intensifying. Over the next 3 days, the evidence mounted. The storm was larger and more powerful than initially thought. Its track appeared to be heading directly for the English Channel. Worst of all, it would arrive precisely on June 5th, the scheduled invasion date. By June 2nd, all the forecasting teams agreed. A major storm was approaching. What they couldn't agree on was what would happen after the storm passed. Colonel Crick's analog forecast suggested the storm would clear quickly, leaving acceptable conditions by the morning of June 5th. His analogues showed similar situations in the past where storms had moved through rapidly. The British teams were less optimistic. Their frontal analysis suggested the storm was part of a larger pattern of unsettled weather that would persist for several days. They predicted that even after the initial storm passed, conditions would remain unsuitable with continuing high winds, rough seas, and low clouds. Stagg found himself in an impossible position. The invasion was scheduled to begin in less than 72 hours. Troops were already loading onto ships, the naval armada was preparing to sail, and his meteorological teams were giving him contradictory forecasts about whether the weather would be acceptable. On June 3rd at 2100 hours, Stagg walked into Southwark House for the first critical forecast meeting with Eisenhower and the senior commanders. The tension in the room was palpable. Every man present understood that the decision to be made that night would determine not just the outcome of the invasion, but possibly the outcome of the entire war. A failed invasion could prolong the war for years, cost hundreds of thousands of additional lives, and potentially allow Germany to develop weapons that could change the strategic balance. Stagg presented his forecast with clinical precision. The storm would arrive on June 4th. Conditions on June 5th would be completely unsuitable for the invasion. Winds would exceed force 5. Waves would reach 6 feet. Cloud ceiling would be below 1,000 feet. Visibility would be less than 2 miles. These conditions were not marginal. They were definitively unacceptable. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, commander of the naval forces, spoke first. "If we sail tonight as scheduled, the fleet will steam directly into the storm. Landing craft will be unmanageable in those seas. We'll lose men to drowning before they ever reach the beaches." Air Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, commander of the air forces, was equally grim. "With that cloud ceiling, the bombers won't be able to see their targets. The pre-invasion bombardment will be completely ineffective. We'll be landing men on beaches that haven't been properly softened up." General Bernard Montgomery, commander of ground forces, was characteristically direct. "We can't land in those conditions. The men will be seasick, exhausted, and disorganized before they ever reach the beach. It would be a massacre." All eyes turned to Eisenhower. The Supreme Commander sat in silence for a long moment, his fingers steepled, his face expressionless. Finally he spoke. "What about June 6th? Stagg had anticipated this question. He had spent the previous 6 hours in heated debate with his forecasting teams about exactly this issue. "Sir, there is disagreement among the forecasting teams about conditions on June 6th. The storm will have passed, but the question is how quickly conditions will improve. The American forecasters believe there will be a rapid improvement. The British forecasters are less optimistic. What do you believe, Stagg?" Eisenhower's question cut through all the diplomatic hedging. He wasn't asking for a consensus. He was asking for Stagg's personal judgment. Stagg took a breath. "Based on my analysis of the frontal structure and upper air patterns, I believe conditions will remain unsuitable through June 6th. The storm system is large and slow-moving. Even after the centre passes, we'll continue to see high winds and rough seas for at least 24 hours. Eisenhower's face showed nothing, but everyone in the room could feel the weight of the moment. The general stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness where thousands of men waited in ships. When he turned back, his decision was made. "We'll postpone 24 hours. The invasion is now scheduled for June 6th. Stagg, we'll meet again tomorrow night at 2100 hours. You'll have another chance to tell me whether we can go." The decision to postpone was immediately controversial. The logistics of delaying an operation of this magnitude were staggering. Ships that had already sailed had to be recalled. Troops had to be kept on board vessels cramped and uncomfortable. The secret of the invasion, already shared with tens of thousands of people, had to be kept for another day. Worse, some of the smaller landing craft lacked the fuel capacity for extended delays. If postponed again, they would need to return to port, refuel, and reload, creating chaos. The window was closing. As Stagg left Southwick House that night, the weight of responsibility was crushing. If his forecast was wrong, if conditions on June 5th turned out to be acceptable, he would have unnecessarily delayed the invasion. But if his forecast was right, if the storm materialized as predicted, he would have saved the operation from potential disaster. June 4th dawned grey and ominous. By mid-morning, the storm Stagg had predicted slammed into southern England with full force. Winds gusted to 40 miles per hour. Rain fell in sheets. The English Channel was a churning mass of whitecaps and spray. Ships that had sailed before the postponement order struggled back to port, taking heavy damage from the seas. Stagg's forecast had been vindicated. The storm was real, and it was every bit as severe as he had warned. But this created a new problem. With conditions this bad on June 4th, how could they possibly improve enough by June 6th for the invasion to proceed? Throughout June 4th, Stagg and his teams worked frantically, analysing every scrap of incoming data, searching for signs of improvement. The storm was behaving largely as predicted, which was good for Stagg's credibility but terrible for the invasion. The frontal analysis showed the main storm centre passing north of Scotland, pulling cold air down behind it. This would bring continuing unsettled weather, high winds and rough seas exactly as the British forecasters had predicted. But then, late in the afternoon of June 4th, something unexpected appeared in the data. Weather reconnaissance aircraft flying west of Ireland reported a ridge of high pressure building behind the storm. Surface observations showed pressure beginning to rise. Upper air data showed winds at altitude beginning to shift. It was a subtle change, easily missed, but to trained eyes, it suggested the possibility of a temporary break in the weather. Stagg called an emergency meeting of his forecasting teams. The debate that followed was intense. Colonel Crick's analogue forecast now showed rapid improvement, with acceptable conditions by the morning of June 6th. His confidence was absolute. The British Admiralty forecaster, Charles Douglas, was more cautious. He acknowledged the ridge of high pressure but warned it might be weak and short-lived. Conditions might improve temporarily, but another storm system was developing behind it. The weather window, if it materialized at all, would be narrow. Stagg pressed for specifics. How long would the improved conditions last? Douglas studied his charts. If the ridge holds, we might get 36 to 48 hours of marginally acceptable conditions beginning early on June 6th. But it's not going to be good weather, just acceptable. Clouds will still be low, around 3,000 to 5,000 feet. Winds will drop to force 3 to 4. Seas will be rough but manageable. And after that? Another depression is approaching from the west, if we don't go on. June 6th, we'll be looking at several more days of unsuitable weather. Stagg spent the hours before the evening meeting weighing the evidence. The high-pressure ridge was real but weak. It offered a brief window, nothing more. The conditions would be marginal at best, far from ideal, but they might be just barely acceptable, and the alternative was further delays with all their attendant risks. At 20:30 hours on June 4th, Stagg entered Southwick House for what he knew would be the most important forecast of his life. The room was even more tense than the previous night. Eisenhower looked exhausted, the strain of command evident in every line of his face. The other commanders sat in various postures of stress and fatigue. Stagg began his briefing. The storm we predicted has materialized exactly as forecast. Current conditions are completely unsuitable for the invasion. However, we have detected a development that was not evident in yesterday's data. A ridge of high pressure is building behind the storm. This will create a temporary break in the weather beginning late on June 5th and lasting through June 6th and possibly into June 7th. Eisenhower leaned forward. Define temporary break and define acceptable conditions. Stagg chose his words carefully. The wind will drop to force 3 to 4, manageable for landing craft though still producing rough seas. Wave heights will decrease to 3 to 4 feet at the upper limit of acceptable but within parameters. Cloud ceiling will lift to 3,000 to 5,000 feet, sufficient for tactical air support though not ideal for heavy bombers. Visibility will improve to 3 to 5 miles, adequate for naval operations. How confident are you in this forecast? Stagg paused. The honest answer was complicated. The ridge of high pressure was based on limited data from a handful of stations and aircraft observations. The models such as they were suggested it would hold, But weather in the North Atlantic was notoriously difficult to predict. If the ridge weakened or shifted track even slightly, conditions could deteriorate rapidly. But Stagg also knew what was at stake. Tens of thousands of men waited in ships. The largest military operation in history was poised to launch. The fate of Europe, perhaps the world, hung on whether he believed his own forecast enough to recommend proceeding. He met Eisenhower's eyes directly. "I am confident that conditions will improve sufficiently to meet minimum requirements for the invasion. The weather will not be good, but it will be adequate. I recommend we proceed." The room erupted in discussion. Admiral Ramsay was cautiously optimistic. The Navy could work with force 3 to 4 winds and 3 to 4 foot seas. It would be uncomfortable and challenging, but manageable. Air Marshal Lee Mallory was less happy. A 3,000 to 5,000 foot cloud ceiling would severely limit the effectiveness of the air campaign, but tactical support would be possible. General Montgomery was ready to go. His ground forces had been cooped up on ships for days. Morale was suffering. Better to land in marginal weather than continue waiting. The discussion continued for nearly an hour. Every commander had concerns, questions, doubts, but gradually a consensus emerged. The weather would be marginal but acceptable. The alternative was further delays with mounting risks to security, logistics, and morale. Finally, Eisenhower called for silence. He stood and walked to the window again, his back to the room. The seconds stretched into a minute, then 2. No one spoke. The only sound was the wind howling outside and the rain pattering against the windows. When Eisenhower turned back, his face was set with determination. "Okay, we'll go." The order went out immediately. The greatest armada ever assembled began moving toward the French coast. Ships departed from ports all across southern England, converging on the English Channel. Paratroopers boarded aircraft. Glider troops loaded into their fragile craft. Rangers checked their weapons. Infantrymen, sailors, and airmen, 156,000 men in total, began moving toward their destiny. Stagg returned to his charts and data, now facing an even more nerve-wracking wait. His forecast had been believed. The invasion was proceeding. But what if he was wrong? What if the ridge of high pressure weakened? What if another storm system moved in faster than predicted? What if conditions deteriorated and men died because he had told Eisenhower the weather would be acceptable? Throughout the night of June 5th and early morning of June 6th, Stagg and his team monitored every incoming weather observation with obsessive intensity. Each hourly report was analysed, plotted, compared to predictions. The ridge of high pressure was holding. Winds were decreasing as forecast. Cloud ceiling was lifting. Visibility was improving. The weather was evolving exactly as Stagg had predicted, but it was still far from ideal. At 300 hours on June 6th, the first airborne troops began dropping over Normandy. Weather reconnaissance aircraft reported conditions over the drop zones. Scattered clouds at 3,000 feet, visibility 4 miles, winds 15 knots. Marginal but acceptable. At 500 hours, naval bombardment began. Weather observers on the ships reported seas 4 feet, winds force 4, visibility 5 miles. Rough but manageable. At 0630 hours, the first troops hit the beaches. The weather they encountered was exactly what Stagg had forecast. Cloudy, windy, rough seas. Visibility decent, but not perfect. It was nobody's idea of good weather, but it was just barely good enough. On Omaha Beach, the weather contributed to the chaos. Rough seas swamped many landing craft before they reached shore. Seasick troops struggled to fight effectively. Low clouds limited air support at a critical moment, but the invasion went forward. On other beaches, conditions were slightly better. Troops got ashore, established beachheads, and began pushing inland. The weather was a factor, a complication, but not a decisive obstacle. By midday on June 6th, it was clear the invasion had succeeded in getting ashore. The outcome was still in doubt. Fighting would continue for weeks, but the crucial first phase had worked. Eisenhower's gamble had paid off. More importantly, Stagg's forecast had been vindicated. The window of acceptable weather had materialized exactly as predicted. And then, on June 7th and 8th, conditions deteriorated again. Another storm system moved in from the Atlantic, bringing high winds, rough seas, and low clouds. If the invasion had been delayed to June 7th, it would have sailed directly into these renewed storms. The weather window Stagg had identified had been real but narrow. The invasion had threaded the needle between two major storm systems, launching during the only 36-hour period in 2 weeks, when conditions were marginally acceptable. Years after the war, when meteorological records could be fully analysed and compared to what actually occurred, Stagg's forecast was recognised as one of the most accurate and consequential weather predictions in history. Using primitive tools and incomplete data, he had detected a weak high-pressure ridge developing 1,000 miles away in the North Atlantic. He had predicted its movement, timing, and duration with sufficient accuracy to enable the largest military operation in history. He had forecast minimum conditions within margins that would have been considered impossible just a few years earlier. But Stagg's achievement went beyond technical accuracy. He had also demonstrated extraordinary courage under pressure. When his forecasting teams disagreed, he had been willing to make a decision based on his own judgment. When commanders pressed him for certainty he couldn't provide, he had been honest about uncertainties while still offering clear recommendations. When the fate of the invasion rested on his words, he had trusted his science and his analysis enough to tell Eisenhower to proceed. The contrast with the German weather forecasting effort is instructive. The Germans also had skilled meteorologists, but they laboured under fatal disadvantages. Their weather observation network in the Atlantic had been largely destroyed by Allied naval dominance. Weather stations in Greenland and Iceland that might have provided crucial data were in Allied hands. U-boats that had previously provided weather reports were being hunted to extinction. Most critically, German meteorologists had failed to detect the high-pressure ridge that created the invasion window. Their forecast for June 6th predicted continued storms and unsuitable conditions. Based on these forecasts, German commanders concluded an invasion was unlikely and maintained reduced alert status. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in Normandy, was so confident the weather precluded invasion that he left the front on June 4th to visit his wife in Germany for her birthday. He was still in Germany when the invasion began. German beach defences were partially unmanned due to the bad weather. Patrol aircraft were grounded. Coastal radar stations operated at reduced capacity. The Germans were caught completely off guard, partly because their weather forecasts told them an invasion in such conditions was impossible. After the war, German meteorologist Walter Stober, who had been responsible for weather forecasting for the Wehrmacht in France, was asked how the Allies could have invaded during such marginal weather. His response was telling. "We never thought they would attempt it in such conditions. Our forecasts showed continuing bad weather. We assumed the Allies would wait for the kind of perfect weather we would have waited for. We didn't understand that they had better forecasts than we did, and were willing to operate in minimal conditions we considered unacceptable." This encapsulated one of the fundamental differences between Allied and German military culture. The Allies, particularly the Americans, were willing to accept higher risks and operate in less than ideal conditions if it provided strategic advantage. The Germans, with their emphasis on thorough preparation and optimal conditions, missed opportunities because they waited for perfection. The weather forecast for D-Day represented more than just meteorological skill. It represented a willingness to trust science, accept calculated risks, and act on incomplete information. Eisenhower's decision to proceed based on Stagg's forecast was an act of leadership that balanced scientific advice with strategic necessity. Stagg himself always maintained a modest view of his achievement. In his post-war memoir he wrote, "I did not win the war, I simply provided information that allowed others to make informed decisions. The courage was Eisenhower's, not mine. He had to make the choice. I merely told him what the weather would be." But this modesty understates Stagg's critical role. Without his forecast identifying the narrow weather window, the invasion might have been delayed to June 7th or later, sailing into the renewed storms that arrived those days. The resulting disaster could have set the war back months or even years. The casualties from a failed invasion attempt would have been catastrophic. The psychological impact of a defeat would have been devastating. The opportunity to surprise the Germans might never have come again. In this sense, the weather forecast for D-Day was as decisive as any battle. It enabled the invasion to proceed during the only suitable window available. It allowed Allied forces to achieve surprise against a complacent enemy. It demonstrated the value of investing in science and trusting expert advice even in matters of war and death. The story also illustrates how technological advantages in unexpected areas can prove decisive. The Allies didn't win D-Day because of weather. They won because of better meteorology, their superior weather observation, network, more advanced forecasting techniques, and willingness to trust scientific advice gave them an edge the Germans couldn't match. This pattern repeated throughout the war. Radar gave Allied forces an advantage in detecting enemy aircraft. Cryptography allowed them to read German communications. Operations research improved convoy routing and anti-submarine tactics. In each case, scientific and technical superiority translated into military advantage. Weather forecasting was simply one more example of how investing in unglamorous technical capabilities could prove as important as building better tanks or fighters. James Martin Stagg continued his meteorological career after the war, eventually becoming director of the British Meteorological Office. He was knighted for his services and received honours from multiple nations. But he rarely spoke publicly about his role in D-Day, maintaining the professional discretion that had served him so well during the war. In his personal papers, preserved after his death in 1975, Stagg reflected on the burden of his responsibility during those crucial days in June 1944. The weight of knowing that my words would determine whether the invasion proceeded or was delayed was almost unbearable. I checked and rechecked every piece of data, questioned every assumption, second-guessed every conclusion. Even after giving my forecast to General Eisenhower, I spent the night wondering if I'd missed something, if I'd made an error that would cost lives. When the invasion succeeded and the weather held as predicted, I felt not triumph, but relief. I had done my job. I had provided accurate information. The decision to use that information was Eisenhower's, and he had decided correctly. But I knew that if the weather had deteriorated, if my forecast had been wrong, the blame would have been mine. That knowledge haunted me for years afterward. The meteorological techniques pioneered by Stagg and his teams during the war became the foundation for modern weather forecasting. The lessons learned about Atlantic storm systems, high-pressure ridges, and frontal movements informed decades of subsequent research. The recognition that weather forecasting could be militarily decisive led to massive post-war investments in meteorological research and technology. Today, weather forecasting capabilities would seem like magic to Stagg and his contemporaries. Satellites provide continuous global coverage. Computer models simulate atmospheric behavior with extraordinary detail. Numerical weather prediction can project conditions days or weeks in advance with accuracy that would have been unimaginable in 1944. But the fundamental challenge remains unchanged. Weather forecasting is still about analysing incomplete data, applying scientific understanding, and making probabilistic judgments about the future. The tools have improved dramatically, but the core human judgment required of forecasters persists, and in critical situations, whether military operations, disaster response, or economic planning, decisions still must be made based on weather forecasts that carry uncertainty. The story of D-Day's weather forecast reminds us that sometimes the most important decisions rest on narrow margins. A slight shift in the high-pressure ridge, a few hours difference in timing, a small error in interpretation, any of these could have changed the forecast and thus changed history. On June 6, 2019, the 75th anniversary of D-Day, a memorial plaque was unveiled at Southwark House, honouring the meteorological team that provided the forecasts enabling the invasion. The inscription reads, "In this room, forecasts were delivered that shaped the course of history. Through science, skill, and courage, they identified the narrow window that made victory possible." The plaque is a fitting tribute, but perhaps the best memorial to Stagg and his team is simply the fact that the invasion succeeded. The weather window they predicted materialized. The troops got ashore, the liberation of Europe began, and all of it was made possible because a Scottish meteorologist looked at weather maps and data, applied his expertise and judgment, and told Eisenhower the truth about what the atmosphere would do 48 hours hence. In the end, the weather didn't decide the fate of D-Day. Human beings did. But the weather forecast gave them the information they needed to make the right decision at the right time, and in June 1944, with the fate of the world hanging in balance, that made all the difference. The storm that Stagg predicted arrived exactly on schedule. The window of opportunity he identified opened precisely as forecast. And through that narrow window, history turned. The success of Stagg's forecast had immediate ripple effects that extended far beyond the beaches of Normandy. Within hours of the first troops hitting the sand, meteorological teams were already working on the next critical forecast. The artificial harbours, codenamed mulberries, were being towed across the channel and needed to be positioned and anchored under acceptable weather conditions. These massive concrete caissons, each weighing thousands of tons, were essential to the invasion's success, providing the logistical capacity to sustain the armies ashore. The forecast called for the window of good weather to last through June 7th, before deteriorating again. This gave engineers barely 36 hours to position the harbour components. Working against the clock, Royal Navy tugs hauled the massive structures across the channel and began sinking them into position off Gold and Omaha beaches. The race against weather was frantic. By late afternoon on June 7th, conditions were already deteriorating. Winds picked up to force 5, seas built to 6 feet. The installation work became increasingly difficult and dangerous, but enough of the harbour components were in place that operations could continue, barely. Then, on June 19th, exactly 2 weeks after the invasion, the weather delivered a blow that nearly matched what a German counterattack might have achieved. The worst storm in the English Channel in 40 years materialised with shocking speed. Winds reached force 8, nearly gale strength. Waves exceeded 15 feet. The storm lasted for 3 days. The American Mulberry Harbour at Omaha Beach was completely destroyed, torn apart by the wind and waves. Over 800 vessels were driven ashore or sunk. Thousands of tons of supplies were lost. The British harbour at Gold Beach survived but took severe damage. The logistics build-up, so carefully planned, was set back by weeks. German commanders, seeing reconnaissance photos of the devastation, briefly hoped that the weather had accomplished what their armies could not, stopping the Allied advance. Stagg and his teams had forecast the storm's approach, but its intensity exceeded all predictions. The irony was bitter. They had successfully predicted the marginal conditions that allowed the invasion to proceed, but failed to anticipate the magnitude of the storm that nearly destroyed the logistical lifeline sustaining it. The June 19th storm became a case study in the limits of 1944-era weather forecasting. Even with all their skill and dedication, the meteorologists couldn't predict everything. The storm had developed rapidly from a relatively innocuous-looking low-pressure system. The lack of detailed observations over the Atlantic meant they couldn't track its intensification with sufficient precision. The models, such as they were, didn't capture the explosive deepening that occurred. In post-storm analysis, Stagg was candid about the forecasting failure. We saw the system developing but underestimated its potential. The data was insufficient to recognize how rapidly it would intensify. This was a humbling reminder that for all our advances we were still reading tea leaves in many respects. The ocean remained largely invisible to us, and storms that formed there could surprise us. But even this failure highlighted the achievement of the D-Day forecast. The meteorological team had successfully identified a narrow window between major storms, enabling the invasion to proceed. That they couldn't predict every subsequent weather event didn't diminish the accuracy and importance of getting the critical forecast right. The military learned crucial lessons from both successes and failures. The importance of weather reconnaissance was reinforced, leading to expanded aircraft missions over the Atlantic. The need for better ocean observations drove post-war investments in weather ships and eventually ocean buoys. The limitations of forecasting beyond 48 to 72 hours were acknowledged, influencing operational planning. Perhaps most importantly, the D-Day experience established that expert scientific advice, even when uncertain, was invaluable for command decisions. Eisenhower's willingness to trust Stagg's forecast, despite the risks and uncertainties, became a model for how commanders should integrate technical expertise into strategic planning. The contrast with German decision-making was stark and consequential. While Rommel was absent on June 6th, due to his confidence that weather precluded invasion, his absence wasn't just bad luck. It reflected a systematic German failure to appreciate the Allied meteorological advantage. German intelligence had noted that Allied forces seemed willing to operate in weather conditions that German doctrine considered unacceptable. But they interpreted this as recklessness rather than recognizing it reflected better forecasting capability. If the Allies were launching operations in marginal weather, it suggested they had confidence in their ability to predict when those marginal conditions would improve. The Germans never fully grasped this implication. Throughout the Normandy campaign and beyond, German forces were repeatedly caught off guard by Allied operations launched during weather windows their own forecasters had missed. Allied bombers attacked through breaks in clouds that German meteorologists hadn't predicted. Naval operations proceeded during brief periods of acceptable seas that appeared on Allied forecasts but not German ones. Airborne operations launched during narrow windows of reduced wind that Allied meteorologists had identified. The cumulative effect was significant. The Germans increasingly operated with the assumption that their intelligence about Allied intentions was poor, when in fact the issue was often that Allied operations were timed to weather conditions the Germans couldn't predict. This meteorological intelligence gap contributed to German strategic confusion throughout the latter part of the war. By late 1944, the Allied meteorological advantage had become institutionalized. Weather reconnaissance flights operated continuously. A network of weather ships, despite losses to submarines, maintained stations in the North Atlantic. Improved upper air observations from weather balloons provided better data about atmospheric conditions at altitude. Most importantly, the forecasting teams had accumulated experience and refined their techniques. The pressure of wartime operations had accelerated the development of meteorology in ways that peacetime research never could have. Forecasters learned from their mistakes in real time, with immediate and often brutal feedback about accuracy. Techniques that worked were refined and shared. Methods that failed were discarded. The pace of improvement was remarkable. By comparison, German meteorological capabilities actually declined as the war progressed. The loss of weather observation posts as territory was captured eliminated data sources. The destruction of weather ships by Allied naval forces created gaps in Atlantic coverage. The death or capture of experienced meteorologists depleted expertise. Most critically, the increasingly defensive nature of German operations meant they had less need for detailed forecasting and thus less opportunity to maintain skills. One of the most remarkable aspects of the D-Day weather forecast was how close it came to not happening at all. Stagg had been appointed Chief Meteorological Officer only in January 1944, less than 6 months before the invasion. If he had been appointed earlier, he would have had more time to establish working relationships with the various forecasting teams and develop the synthesis process. If appointed later, he might not have had sufficient time to build the credibility necessary for Eisenhower to trust his recommendations. The selection of Stagg himself was fortuitous. He possessed the rare combination of scientific expertise, diplomatic skill, and personal courage necessary for the role. Many other meteorologists of the era, while scientifically competent, lacked the ability to navigate the political complexities of coordinating British and American forecasting teams. Others had the diplomatic skills but lacked the scientific depth to challenge forecasts they believed were wrong. Stagg's immediate superior, Charles Douglas, later wrote that Stagg was possibly the only meteorologist in Britain who could have successfully filled the role. His Scottish background made him acceptable to both British and American teams, neither of whom would have fully trusted someone from the other nation. His scientific credentials were impeccable, silencing potential criticism about competence. His personality, reserved but firm, allowed him to manage strong-willed subordinates without creating resentment. The contingent nature of historical events is rarely more apparent than in the story of D-Day's weather forecast. A different meteorologist might have made different judgments. A slightly different atmospheric configuration might have produced a different forecast. A small change in the high-pressure ridge's track or timing could have made the weather window disappear. Any of these variations could have changed history. Some historians have argued that the weather forecast was the decisive factor in D-Day's success, more important than any military decision or tactical innovation. This overstates the case, but not by much. Without the forecast identifying the narrow window of opportunity, the invasion would likely have been delayed. Given the pattern of continuing storms through mid-June, the delay might have stretched to July when tidal and moon conditions would again be suitable. A July invasion would have faced different challenges. The longer delay would have increased the risk of the secret being compromised. German defences would have had more time to strengthen. The campaign season would have been shorter, possibly forcing Allied armies to winter short of the Rhine. The cascade of strategic implications from a delayed invasion is impossible to calculate precisely, but all pointed toward a longer, costlier war. Conversely, attempting invasion on June 5th in the face of the storm would likely have been catastrophic. Landing craft would have swamped in rough seas. Seasick troops would have been unable to fight effectively. Naval gunfire support would have been impossible. Air support would have been severely limited by low clouds and poor visibility. The casualties would have been horrific, and the invasion might have failed completely. Between these two unacceptable alternatives, Stagg's forecast identified a third option: launch on June 6th, during a brief window of marginally acceptable weather. It wasn't a perfect solution. The weather remained a significant challenge for invading forces, but it was just barely good enough, and just barely good enough proved sufficient. The narrow margin between success and failure in the D-Day weather forecast raises uncomfortable questions about the role of chance in history. If the high-pressure ridge had been slightly weaker, or had tracked 100 miles further north, the window wouldn't have opened. Stagg would have had to recommend further delays. The invasion might not have occurred until July or even later. All of this would have been due to atmospheric dynamics completely beyond human control. In this sense, the weather on D-Day represents the ultimate contingency. No amount of planning, preparation, or courage could control whether that high-pressure ridge would develop and create acceptable conditions. The Allies could only wait, hope, and be ready to exploit any opportunity that appeared. That the opportunity did appear was, in some sense, simply luck. But the ability to recognize the opportunity when it appeared, to forecast it with sufficient accuracy and confidence to base the largest military operation in history upon it, was not luck. That was skill, science, and courage. The legacy of the D-Day weather forecast extended far beyond the immediate military impact. The demonstrated value of accurate forecasting for military operations drove massive post-war investments in meteorology. In 1947, the United States Weather Bureau underwent major expansion, driven partly by military requirements. The US Air Force established the Air Weather Service, recognizing that air operations depended fundamentally on atmospheric conditions. The Navy maintained weather ships in the Atlantic and Pacific, despite the expense, because the military value of ocean observations had been proven. Research into weather forecasting techniques accelerated. The development of numerical weather prediction in the late 1940s and early 1950s, using the first electronic computers to solve atmospheric equations, was partly driven by military demand for better forecasts. The launch of weather satellites in the 1960s was justified partly on the basis that military operations required global weather intelligence. Each advance built on the foundation established during World War II, when weather forecasting proved its strategic value. The D-Day forecast also influenced how organizations think about expert advice in decision-making. Eisenhower's decision to trust Stagg's forecast despite its uncertainties and despite the enormous stakes became a case study in leadership. Military academies teach it as an example of how commanders should integrate technical expertise into operational planning. Business schools cite it as a model for decision-making under uncertainty. The core lesson is that expert advice, even probabilistic advice that can't guarantee outcomes, is valuable when making critical decisions. The alternative isn't certainty, which is impossible in complex situations. The alternative is ignorance, making decisions without the best available information and analysis. Eisenhower understood this. When Stagg told him the weather would be marginally acceptable but not good, Eisenhower didn't demand perfect conditions or absolute certainty. He accepted the forecast at face value, weighed it against other factors, and made his decision. This seems obvious in retrospect, but it represented a sophisticated understanding of how to use expert advice that many leaders lack. The temptation is always to demand certainty from experts, to treat probabilistic forecasts as failures of expertise rather than honest representations of uncertainty. Eisenhower's example showed a better way. In the decades since D-Day, weather forecasting has been transformed by technology that would seem like magic to Stagg and his contemporaries. Satellites provide continuous global coverage, showing cloud patterns, measuring temperatures, tracking storms in real time. Weather radar networks detect precipitation and severe weather. Computer models simulate atmospheric behavior with billions of calculations. Numerical weather prediction can project conditions a week or more in advance. But for all these advances, the fundamental challenge remains similar. Forecasters must still analyze data, apply scientific understanding, make judgments about uncertain future conditions, and communicate those judgments to decision-makers who must act on them. The tools have improved dramatically, but the core task persists. Modern meteorologists studying the D-Day forecast often express amazement at what Stagg and his teams accomplished with such limited tools. Identifying a weak high-pressure ridge 1,000 miles away using only surface observations and weather balloon data required extraordinary skill. Predicting its track, timing, and duration with sufficient accuracy to enable the invasion was remarkable. Doing all this under intense pressure with the fate of nations hanging on the forecast was exceptional. Some of this amazement reflects how much the science has advanced. Modern forecasters, accustomed to satellite imagery and computer models, can hardly imagine working with the limited data available in 1944. But some of it reflects genuine respect for the achievement. Even with modern tools, predicting a narrow weather window between major storms remains challenging. Stagg did it with tools that seem primitive by today's standards. The D-Day weather forecast also highlights the often invisible role of science in human affairs. The beaches of Normandy are dotted with monuments to the soldiers who fought there, and rightly so. Their courage and sacrifice was extraordinary. But there are no monuments to the meteorologists whose forecasts made the invasion possible. Stagg's name is known primarily to specialists in meteorology and military history. The general public, if they think about D-Day weather at all, probably assumes it was just lucky that conditions were acceptable. But luck had little to do with it. The weather window existed due to atmospheric dynamics. The decision to exploit that window was based on Stagg's forecast. The forecast was accurate due to the skill of meteorologists analysing data and applying scientific understanding. The entire chain of events depended on investments in meteorological infrastructure, training, and expertise that had been made over the preceding decades. This pattern of invisible science enabling visible achievement is common throughout history. Antibiotics saved millions of lives, but most people never think about the chemistry that made them possible. GPS guides millions of travellers, but few consider the physics and engineering behind it. Weather forecasts enable countless decisions daily, from what clothes to wear to whether to launch spacecraft, but the science remains largely invisible. The D-Day forecast is an unusually clear example where the contribution of science to a specific historical outcome can be directly traced. Most of the time, the connections are more diffuse and harder to document, but they're always there, shaping outcomes in ways that often go unrecognized. Stagg himself was always uncomfortable with attention focused on his role. He insisted that he had simply done his job, that the real heroes were the men who fought on the beaches, that the real decision was Eisenhower's, not his. This modesty was genuine, but also deflected from the magnitude of his achievement. Doing his job required extraordinary skill under extraordinary pressure, and the consequences of failure would have been catastrophic. When Stagg died in 1975, his obituaries in British newspapers focused mainly on his post-war career as director of the Meteorological Office. The role in D-Day was mentioned but not emphasised. Only in meteorological journals was the full significance of his achievement recognised. The Journal of the Royal Meteorological Society published a memorial article noting that Stagg's forecast was possibly the most consequential weather prediction ever made, affecting the outcome of the war and thus the shape of the post-war world. In recent decades, there has been increasing recognition of Stagg's role. Books have been written about the D-Day forecast, including Stagg's own memoir published in 1971. Historical markers have been placed at Southwark House, where the fateful meetings occurred. On significant anniversaries of D-Day, meteorologists gather to commemorate the forecast that made the invasion possible. But this recognition remains largely within specialised communities. Ask most people about D-Day, and they'll mention Eisenhower's decision, the bravery of the troops, perhaps the deception operations that convinced Germans the invasion would come at Calais. Few will mention the weather forecast that identified when the invasion could proceed. This reflects a broader tendency to undervalue the role of science and expertise in human affairs. Dramatic events like military invasions are attributed to leaders and soldiers, while the technical expertise enabling those events remains invisible. The result is a distorted understanding of how major achievements actually happen. The truth is that D-Day succeeded due to a combination of factors: military planning, logistics, training, courage, leadership, deception operations, and many other elements all contributed. But weather forecasting was among the most critical factors, because without an accurate forecast identifying when to launch the invasion, all the other preparations would have been wasted. The weather didn't care about plans or courage or determination. It would be acceptable or unacceptable, based on atmospheric dynamics completely beyond human control. The only thing humans could control was whether they accurately predicted those dynamics, and made decisions accordingly. Stagg and his team controlled that one crucial variable, and their success reverberated through history. Every time someone checks a weather forecast before making plans, every time a pilot consults weather briefings before flying, every time a ship captain studies weather maps before sailing, they're benefiting from the science that Stagg and his contemporaries helped establish. The techniques have been refined, the tools have improved dramatically, but the fundamental enterprise of predicting future atmospheric conditions based on current observations and scientific understanding remains the same. And sometimes, though rarely as dramatically as on June 6, 1944, those predictions still shape the course of events in profound ways. Hurricanes are tracked and warnings issued, saving countless lives. Severe thunderstorms are forecast, allowing communities to prepare. Winter storms are predicted, enabling transportation and utility companies to position resources. Favorable weather windows are identified for everything from rocket launches to agricultural operations. In all these cases and countless others, weather forecasting enables better decisions. The science that proved its worth on D-Day continues to provide value every day, mostly invisibly, rarely acknowledged, but always essential. The high-pressure ridge that created the invasion window moved on, as weather systems always do. The storms that followed eventually cleared. The weather on June 7th was slightly worse than June 6th, but still acceptable. By June 8th, conditions had deteriorated significantly, exactly as Stagg had predicted. The window had been real but narrow, just as his forecast indicated. In the end, the weather forecast for D-Day stands as a testament to human capability in the face of uncertainty. Stagg and his teams couldn't control the weather, but they could understand it well enough to predict it. They couldn't eliminate risk, but they could quantify it and communicate it clearly. They couldn't guarantee success, but they could provide the information needed for others to make informed decisions. That proved to be enough. The invasion launched, the armies landed, the liberation began. The weather was marginal, but acceptable. The forecast was uncertain, but accurate. And the ridge of high pressure that created the opportunity, detected by a handful of meteorologists analysing incomplete data in a manor house in southern England, opened the narrow gate through which history passed into a different future.